is from Douglas Adams. The fact that we live at the bottom of a deep gravity well on the surface of a gas-covered planet going around a nuclear fireball 90 million miles away and think this to be normal is obviously some indication of how skewed our perspective tends to be. And with that, I would like to introduce our guest on today's episode of The Switch, Derek from Veritasium. Derek, welcome to The Switch.
Thank you for having me.
So, I want to get into a bunch of ideas, including your YouTube channel, how you ask questions, and a myriad of other things. But I really like to start these interviews talking about your story. I want to get a little bit about where you came from. And the way I typically tend to frame it is, if you could divide your life into epochs, where I was then, where I am now, how would you describe how you made that transition from one epoch to the next? What kinds of switches were there in that?
I think there's been several epochs. I think also associated with geography, changes in geography. So I grew up in Vancouver, Canada, and I think I had a pretty lucky upbringing. I had a nice family, 2 older sisters, and I guess, in hindsight now, looking back, I feel like one of the sort of defining characteristics of my personality, and something I feel like I was born with, was some sort of innate competitiveness streak. So, I still remember in elementary school when I first heard someone talk about straight A's with reverence. And I was like, what are straight A's? What is that? What is this thing? And I think I sort of internalized that was something that I wanted to do. I sort of set these targets for myself, in a sense, to kind of prove to myself what I could do. Like, I was interested, I guess, in proving myself against the world, or even proving myself against others. Like, it seems to me like an innate thing, and I don't know if it's just innate to me or innate to everyone, but is that question of kind of like, how do I stack up, or where do I fit in this hierarchy? This kind of assumes there is a hierarchy. I don't know. I don't know how deeply I was thinking about these questions as a kid, but I definitely know that I was competitive, and that I wanted to achieve well in all matters, but particularly matters academic. And I don't know if that's came easier to me or whatever. But anyway, so school was fun. I had great teachers. I really enjoyed going to school. I was good at it. I was typically top of the class, and that's all the way through elementary school, through high school. And I don't know if science was one of those things that I was drawn to, because it gave me some really solid answers, some hard answers, things that I really enjoyed. I enjoyed figuring out how the universe works. Something very appealing to my brain about learning about physics and chemistry and mathematics. Those things really appealed to my brain. So did history and English and French and stuff as well. But for some reason, there was something grounding about science. And still to this day, I feel like one of the things that draws me towards science is the way that it seems to me to build on itself and takes us so much further than a lot of these other disciplines. It's a distinction I often draw when I'm talking to people, when I think about accomplishments in fashion, or in film, or in music. I feel like those things ebb and flow, and they come and go with taste, and you often see the same cycles repeating. Like, why are we seeing 80s happening in fashion again? It's because there isn't really anything new. You're not going to get the Higgs boson of fashion, because that it just doesn't work that way. It doesn't go to that level. And maybe that just shows what a neophyte I am when it comes to those areas. Maybe this is just like serious Dunning-Kruger that I'm carefully embedded in. But when I think about accomplishments like the detection of gravitational waves, or the or the Higgs boson or something like that, I think about all of the people and discoveries that needed to come before that was even possible to conceive of that, and then to build it and to make it work. And, so that's really what blows my mind when it comes to science, is like this ability to really build. And there was a definition of science I remember, and I don't remember who said it, um, but it's the one where like the sort of novice or the student of this generation can be as knowledgeable as the expert of the previous generation. When that happens, you know it's a science. So I've long been fascinated by science, really interested in it. And when I got to the end of high school, I had a scholarship to go and study engineering at one of the really good universities in Canada, Queen's University. And I sort of was pulled in multiple directions because although I really enjoyed science and, you know, I loved learning about it, I felt like a deeper calling within me was to do something more creative. I felt like a deeper calling was to be an actor or a filmmaker or a film director or something in that vein. Um, so I have long felt that tension. And simultaneously, I have felt that the career path for creative people is sucky and it's not very well defined. And that's scary. Particularly, I think, you know, if you frame it in the context of feeling like I have an ability to be competent and an ability to be very good at the things that I want to be, to contemplate moving into an area where competence maybe matters less or matters not at all, dare I say, you know, it that felt like a very scary decision to make. So at the end of high school, I remember writing to my dad and being like, maybe I should just take a year off and explore this like film and theater thing. Uh, and you know, I can always go back and do engineering, etc. And he kind of wrote back and was like, in no uncertain terms, you know, you were going to college, like, you know, finish college, and then if you want to do something else, you can. And we actually had a pretty big like fight about this. And I wrote to him and I was like, I'm not going to live my life by parental decree, I believe is the words I used. And he still brings that up to this day of like, geez, you know, what strong worded emails from, you know, a young man. Anyway, ultimately I guess I caved, I capitulated, I went to college. And I think the main reason wasn't actually that my dad told me that I couldn't. I think it was the deep fear of doing something, like trying to do something creative and failing at it, or just finding that it was impossible, or just feeling like a loser or whatever. I still had that competitive thing in me, and one thing about that competitive drive is like I wanted to finish like before everyone. You know, I wanted to, you know, top high school, and I wanted to get out of college, and I wanted like everything, and I wanted it now, and I didn't want to wait, and I wanted to be first, and I didn't want to be, you know, 30 and doing it. One of those realizations I think you have when you're older, when you realize like how meaningless that drive for speed was. There was no need to really rush, but at that point I felt rushed. So I went to college and I studied engineering physics, Queens. And I definitely had the experience, particularly I think in the first year, of feeling like I was at some sort of weird camp, where I was kind of like going through the motions, and you know, I was just like there. I was kind of, it was a really weird disconnect time for me. So maybe this would be like the second epoch, and I moved across the country from Vancouver to Kingston, Ontario, you know, which is near Toronto. And so I was away, you know, totally away from my family. I was still 17 years old. Just I have a late birthday, and you know, I'd broken up with my girlfriend who went off to Harvard, and you know, we'd been together a long time. So I think everything together was like a massive explosion at the beginning of college. And I went from, you know, the kid who had like the perfect record at school, who graduated with like a 98% average, to skipping at least half my classes, particularly because I didn't find them very useful. I didn't find the teachers particularly good. You know, I had gone to this high school where, you know, down to a teacher, they were all pretty extraordinary. And now at college, I didn't know why, but all of the lecturers, I say all, but many of the lecturers kind of sucked. even in their command of the English language, which, you know, you would say like, well, is that really important? But I think as like a 17-year-old kid who's waking up at 8 a.m. to try to get to his lecture, like if it's like hard to understand what you're saying, you know, I'm just going to skip that. And it was in this transitional time where they were starting to put notes online and stuff like that. So I didn't even feel like I needed to be there. And I was psychologically distressed about the whole breakup. And I spent much of the first term like in tears. And, you know, I don't know. It was weird. It was totally weird for me. So, you know, somehow I kind of muddled through first year, and then I tried to get into some of the other things that were interesting to me. So, I think I started to try to take a few film courses at college, which was kind of weird for an engineering physics kid. And, you know, I bought a camera in second year and I started making goofy videos with my buddies. So this would be like 2001, 2002. So YouTube's not around yet. So, you know, one of my more capable computer science friends, you know, coded up a website for us, and we had a server in our closet, and we were, you know, doing the original kind of like streaming videos out of the closet. And we were going around campus with like stickers, and we were slapping them all over the place to like try to advertise our site and get people to come there. But we're just doing like stupid comedy skit things and, you know, kind of embarrassing content by today's standards. But anyway, finished up college. Like I say, like to me, it was a weird mix of like, yeah, this is really cool stuff, and I like learning physics, and I also like being competitive. But some of the edge had come off, and like I wanted to be more creative, but I wasn't doing that. And so I don't know, 2004 rolls around, and I decide that, you know, got offered a job at a nuclear power station near Toronto, and I turned them down. And I told them because I wanted to move to Australia and become a filmmaker. So strange sort of sidewards pivot. But that brings us to the next epoch, where I just moved to Australia with not a lot in the way of planning. I had like one suitcase, and I brought my computer, which at the time was like a tower. So I had my tower in like a box, and a backpack and my suitcase. Rolled into Australia in June 2004 into Sydney. And I didn't really know anyone on the continent. But as luck would have it, I was born in Australia because my parents were there on business in the early 80s. And so I had an Australian passport, but otherwise no real context in the country, no real sense of what I was going to do. So just sort of like landed, met some people on the plane who were like, well, you can come with us to Manly Beach. So I did that. And then, yeah, tried to find somewhere to stay for the night. So it was super disorganized. And so from there, I was trying to figure out like, well, what am I going to do here? And what I knew about the film school that I wanted to go to is called Australian Film, Television, Radio School. And it's sort of like, it was like this beacon to me of like a place where I would go, and it would be a path to a creative career. I remember when I was 17, when I was, you know, making that transition from high school to college, I had written to them, and I had said, you know, look, I want to come and attend. And they had written back, which was very kind of them, to say like their average age of student was 26. And, you know, this is like a postgraduate program, and they would typically take like 4 kids into each department. So 4 students in directing, 4 in producing, 4 in cinematography, etc. So it was like very, you know, elite and challenging to get in. I don't know, that may have appealed to me as well. But so yeah, coming to Australia, thinking like that's where I want to end up, but also realizing that like as a 21-year-old engineering physics graduate, like I'm not the obvious candidate for, you know, entry into this film school. So I was like, I gotta figure out some way of getting myself into this. So after like trying to find jobs and doing a variety of things in Sydney in the first like month, I ended up thinking like, well, what if I did some sort of graduate degree, and what if I tried to merge like physics and film together? So that's how I ended up at the School of Physics at the University of Sydney, doing a PhD in physics education research. And this was within 2 months of landing on the continent and just sort of like somehow I ended up just agreeing to do that and just committing to it, which I think in hindsight is, again, kind of crazy. And it's one of those things where it's like, I wanted to do it fast. I wanted to make those decisions, make those moves, and get it done. And in Australia, one of the things that appealed to me was this idea of you can get a PhD in 3 to 4 years, which, out of your undergrad, where, in North America and Europe, I think it's more like 5 to 6 or 7 years. Yeah. So it definitely felt like, this is like, I'm streamlining, I'm getting to the finish line before anyone else. And also like this attempt to merge creative interests and scientific interests. And then the PhD was challenging because I find that the whole field of education research is actually not well developed and not very scientific. I would almost argue that it's like pre-paradigmatic in like a Kuhnian sense, and we can dig into that if that's of interest. But as a scientist coming into that field, that was incredibly frustrating. So I found my time doing a PhD a bit like, trying to merge two things and finding that it satisfied neither my creative interests in being a filmmaker, and it also didn't satisfy my sort of scientific interest in doing real hardcore science research. So I was in a bit of a jam, but I finished anyway before I turned 25. And like that satisfied a certain sense in me to like be accomplishing and be like, putting some scores on a board or something. I don't know how to conceptualize it, but that was sort of necessary. And while I was doing that PhD, I had been working at a tutoring company in Sydney. So kids would come after school and I would essentially teach them physics in small groups. This was classes of about 12 to 14. And I'd really enjoyed that. And that had been kind of one of the things I really looked forward to, if you're like slogging away at research and you got to go to the library and you got to write your paper and you got to get your references formatted correctly. It was just such a beautiful freedom to be able to like clock out at like 3:30, hop on the train, go and meet my class of students. And they were typically like, good above average students who were like pushing themselves to like get to the top. And like, those are my people, those are the people that, and I felt I viewed my role as a bit like a personal trainer. It's the kind of thing where I'm like, a lot of students are capable or would be capable of taking themselves through the textbook. Like in a sense, teaching is redundant. And again, themes we can come back to. But at the same time, like gyms exist and weights exist and people can, train themselves to bulk up and stuff. They don't typically, unless they have someone there to whom they're accountable and who forces them to put in the reps and really motivates them and is like, this is what you got to do, and like really hypes them up. And like, I get that. I need a personal trainer to really work out to the fullest ability. So I viewed that as kind of my role of hanging out with these kids. And it was like a performance for me. For 7 years, I was going into these, small groups, and I was putting on a show. And, sometimes I would do 9 hours of teaching every day for 2 weeks, Monday to Friday. And that would be doing the same class 3 times every day, a 3-hour lesson 3 times per day. And, every time it would be like, how can I find a way to get to that joke better? Or how can I, make the penny drop on this statement? Like sometimes I would do a lesson that would literally give me chills up my spine as I would teach it. So there was something that like connected with me and that hit me very, very hard. And so when I finished my PhD, the plan was kind of like, well, I'm going to apply to this film school. And what actually happened was the film school was moving. They were changing locations, and they weren't taking any students that year. So I was sort of in this jam of like, oh well, I thought I was going to do this. While I was doing my PhD, I had volunteered on a couple films, and it had been a little bit disillusioning because working on these student films that had like terrible scripts, and I had seen these productions that probably cost at least $100,000, and they had all these experts and people coming in, like so many people working hard to make this thing. And then ultimately, like, what was this film? Like, it was a piece of garbage. and all these people volunteering their time, including me. I really liked being, I was a second assistant director on one film, and I loved doing that. But simultaneously, like, the film was terrible, and this again connected with another part of my personality, which is like, I I really struggle with waste, with seeing things that are so hopelessly wasteful, and creating drama, like dramatic films, really feels like it can be an incredible waste. Um, so that was a real turnoff for me, and like started to freak me out. And I was thinking, like, well, at least, if you make a documentary film or you make an educational film, it may not be the prettiest thing in the world or whatever, but it's about something. So like, at least someone cares. At least it's saying something, hopefully new and different and important, or useful. Um, Being useful seems to me like a core thing that's important to me. So anyway, film school wasn't an option. So I took on a job working full time at a or at the tutoring company. So I started running the science department of this tutoring company, and I loved it. I was overseeing the education of about 800 students. I had 20 teachers working for me, and another 12 sort of younger kids who were doing all the marking and sort of other tutoring duties. And I felt entrepreneurial, which really connected with me in a way. I was managing our AdWords account, and I took on a project of creating a database, or finding a database and implementing it for the entire business, opening our second campus. And like, I just loved that sort of stuff. I think in the past I had this misconception about business, because my sister went into business, and I always had this very cynical view that, like, you go into business when you're interested in money and nothing else. That was kind of like the cynical impression that I held up until that point. But actually being involved in it, I was like, oh, this is great. It gets me to flex a whole bunch of muscles that I didn't, haven't used in forever. And so it's fantastic. Fast forward a couple years, and I come to the final, I think, and the big shift, the epoch shifting thing. So at this tutoring company, my boss, who was also the owner, he was starting to talk about having a general manager for the business, and he picked someone to come from outside the business in, and like, I'd been working with him for 5 or 6 years, or around that, and so I went to him and I was like, dude, don't hire someone else in. Like, I am the obvious person for this job. I know everything about this business. I know how to make it better. I know what the students want. I know how to teach, like, I'm the guy, obviously. And he was like, nope. And it forced me to think about, like, where I wanted to be in 5 years, where I wanted to be in 10 years. And I'd really loved, like, a lot of that work. But simultaneously, I didn't see my life's work as being like, I run a tutoring company, or I manage the education of thousands of kids in Sydney. For some reason, that just wasn't the thing. And the thing always was doing something creative, making films. But, like, ironically, I got to be like 27 years old with not much of a repertoire of films to show anyone. Like, what would I have shown? So I at some point did make applications to a theater school in Australia, and got rejected. I made multiple applications later to the film school and was rejected. And it was kind of obvious why, because I didn't have anything to show for that interest in being creative. I didn't have much of any, I'd never, like, taken my both hands and, like, applied them to some sort of creative project. And I was thinking, like, what an idiot, kind of. And like, I felt like my whole life to that point had been, like, all about expediency and pragmatism. I did the engineering and physics because that was a thing that was like a marketable skill, and I did a PhD because that's better than being a theater bum, or like, so maybe my biggest fear was not being able to support myself, and being sort of like not having enough money to have a home and food to eat, like, maybe that, I don't know. I feel like that's sort of core to it. But I'd gotten to this place with the tutoring school where it's like, I was being paid well enough, I had enough savings. And so just that realization hit me, was like, I've got to stop doing the thing that I think is expedient, and I need to do the thing that I have told myself that I really want to do, and it's like core to my being, and is like where the vision that I have for myself. And so it's funny, the name, Veritasium, now the name of this channel, kind of started as this name of a philosophy for me. It was like that was the name for my life philosophy switch from like, I'm going to date this person because like they're pretty cool and I like them for now, but like, probably not long term, but like, whatever, this is good for now. And like, we'll just go with that. And like, this job is good and I like it. And, like, the job one is hard because not only was it good, it was really quite great. It just wasn't the vision, it wasn't the thing. So that was an even harder one to say like, okay, no, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna resign working here full time, and I'll teach a little bit so I can pay the bills, but I'm out. And this was the end of 2010, start of 2011. I started the YouTube channel, and that was my big shift. I broke up with a girl I was dating at the time, and I was like, no, no more of this. It is all about, I'm just going straight for the thing that I want now. Enough of doing the things that seem expedient or pragmatic. And so the last 10 years of my life have been really about pursuing things that I'm more or less wholeheartedly, passionate about. And that has led me to do, hundreds of YouTube videos and, conferences, some documentaries, TV shows. And I don't know how much detail to get into that, but I know that is the switch in a nutshell.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there are so many things there. One of the first things that jumps out at me, you mentioned fear a couple of times. And I wanted to ask specifically about how you moved from, you mentioned that you had a deep-seated fear of failing at something creative. And that was sort of, the push into going to college. But then at some point, you made the leap to go to Australia in spite of that fear. How did you manage the fear in that situation? And like, what has your relationship been in more detail with fear of failure? Like, do you still experience that? And
oh yeah,
yeah, what's that like?
Fear of failure, I think, is core to everyone's being. For some reason, that fear doesn't seem to enter into big moves for me. When I went to Queens, I didn't even look at where it was on a map, really. I arrived at the airport in Toronto and I was like, now where do I go? And I was lucky there was someone on my plane who was like, oh, you're going to Queens? You need to get to Kingston. I was like, Kingston? How do I get there? He was like, well, I'm going on this bus. You want to come with me? And I was like, okay. So, that's kind of how I rolled. And when I went to Sydney, it was the same thing. It was like, got on the plane and didn't really know where I was going to spend my first night. But it was like, whatever happens, I'll figure it out. I'll find somewhere. Those don't seem to be the scary moments to me for some reason. Those are seemingly small decisions, or they're, it's an adventure or whatever. It's exploratory. But making a life choice, like I'm going to take a year out and I am just going to try to be an actor, or I'm going to be a film director. That is scary. That is scary at some sort of core level, because if you screw that up, I don't know, it seemed life ending,
Yeah.
Not that I think like now with hindsight, like obviously it wouldn't have been.
Right.
But that thing at that time, it was like, got to keep the wheels turning, got to keep moving forward, got to keep, achieving things, putting runs up on the board, like that to me is so core to who I am and my being. So yeah, those moves didn't faze me, but like committing to a creative career was one of the scariest things I could have ever done.
And now that you've been doing the YouTube channel for 10 years or so, what is your relationship with fear now? Do you still, I mean, you said you still have fear.
Yeah. I mean, now it's a different kind of fear. It's like whenever you put something out there, that it's going to be seen by a significant audience. And I think that makes it harder to be creative and be free and be open, try new things. I was talking to someone today about how, like, if you were to witness my classes from back in the day, like I was much weirder and quirkier and funnier than I am in my YouTube videos. Kind of because I feel like there's nothing worse than someone who's trying to be funny and is not funny. Like I feel like that's the worst thing. So if I can just be like serious and normal and, you know, fine, like that's better than the risk. But obviously even better would be to be able to find my own voice and personality and be able to bring that across in the videos. So something still for me to endeavor to do, but yeah, that fear maybe makes me pick certain topics or do things in a particular way, and it's something that I fight against for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So the other thing that stood out to me that I was actually going to ask you about a little later, but I think this is a great time to introduce it. You talked a lot about, or you had some interesting criticisms of education. How, well, what do you see as wrong with current education models? And, you know, I have more to say after that, but let's talk about specifically the current structures of education. What do you see is the failure, and what could happen? What could we be doing to teach our kids better? You know, all the way from young age through college.
Let me start by flipping that question
Sure.
and saying that in my experience, a lot of my education was extraordinary and very, very good. Particularly all of the teachers I had in Vancouver, you know, elementary school, high school. When you have a great teacher, I mean, it
Yeah.
makes all the difference. And when I thought about making YouTube videos about physics, like I was thinking like I could be that teacher for people who just don't have it. That's kind of how I was originally conceptualizing myself. I think one of the things I rubbished in my long rambling talk was education research, which I think is absolutely, and I'm using a broad brush here, but largely pre-paradigmatic. I think the researchers are interested in the results, and they don't do experiments that are more to find out how it is, but to prove that I am right.
Mm.
And that's a big issue.
Yeah.
I think it's not good research. I think, you know, with p hacking, et cetera, like it leads to a lot of issues. So I can talk to the cows come home about how education research is troubled. Education itself, I feel like it's one of those things that you can't really, is it good, is it bad? One thing I can tell you is that it's always a punching bag. Like education is always this thing you can beat up on, and everyone will always say, yeah, education sucks, we're doing it wrong. Like in the education of the future, we're going to have a digital computer and it's going to teach everyone exactly how they need to be taught and blah, blah, blah. I don't buy in, man. I don't buy in. And I'm pretty sure this COVID is showing exactly what I would have hypothesized, which is that like distance learning sucks and you need someone face to face with you to really hold your hand through this. So that's what I think. I think like the best model of education is where you have like a caring, passionate, knowledgeable teacher, and you have a room full of students who are into it and are willing to sort of give some of themselves to it. And there's back and forth. There's the creation of culture and like community amongst those learners, and they all like push the ball forward.
Yeah.
And that can happen in the current system. The other thing that can happen in the system is, and I think like this was particularly relevant to college experience, is that like the teachers are not hired for being teachers. They're hired for being researchers. And research is valued so much at all these top institutions that they, and also like in regards to tenure, in regards to promotions, et cetera, that professors focus on the research and they don't focus on the teaching. And so you get lower quality teaching. And I think like that should surprise no one. It's also trying to do it at scale, and things are harder to do at scale when you have a 400 student lecture theater. For a time, I lectured at University of Technology, Sydney, and I had the intro physics class for non-majors. And, you know, I had like 400 students in my theater, and I would get everyone to grab cards from the front that I printed up that it simply had like A and B on one card and C and D on the other card, just so I could check myself as I was going through the lecture. So, you know, I think like the style, like, is the lecture fundamentally flawed? Like, not in my view. In my view, there are things you can do with a lecture that are flawed, and there are things you can do that are much more beneficial for student learning. And one of those things is simply just checking in with kids and asking them to, state their current knowledge and getting them to try some problems and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know, does that address your question a little bit?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point there about when you have a good teacher, it's a great experience. And I think that really points to kind of the human flaws in education. And just as a teacher, you're vulnerable to flaws every human has, right? Not being able to know if somebody's comprehending what you're getting, interpersonal issues, just all the things that would go into making somebody a poor communicator or a poor example for another person. So I think I think you brought that up basically, and I think that's a really good point.
You mentioned feeling like a personal trainer for education. That's really interesting that you say that. We interviewed Ray Batra, who's the CEO of a startup called Shift Up, where they've put together a learning gym where they essentially have a community that acts as those same forces that a personal trainer has, where you've got accountability, you've got someone coaching you, but a lot of the educational material is a hybrid between things that are being taught by the actual people, the staff there, and online courses, but they'll still build you a roadmap. Like you're still doing the work, but just like a personal trainer might build you an education plan, might build you a fitness plan, they'll build you an education plan, and it's up to you to do the lifting. It's cool. It's worth checking out.
That sounds cool. And I think like the most important and the most integral piece of that is how connected does the learner feel to that person that they're accountable to? Like how accountable do they really feel?
Yeah.
If it's someone that you have to look in the eye and like either say yes or no, I did my homework or I didn't or whatever, that's, I think, hugely important.
Yeah.
And it gets minimized in a lot of these conversations.
Yeah. So, okay. I have many things. I want to get into Veritasium, the YouTube channel. How did you envision that when you started? Like, what did you imagine that you were contributing to the YouTube space?
Yeah, I didn't know much about what was out there in the YouTube space. I think that I conceptualized my role as the good teacher for people who hadn't had a good teacher. So I was really thinking that what I was going to do on Veritasium was I was going to start with the simplest pieces. And like the first video I really made was about the atomic hypothesis, the idea that everything is made up of atoms, and it comes from Feynman saying, like, if you were to erase all of scientific knowledge and leave the next generation just a single sentence, like what would that sentence be that would give them the best leg up to try to rebuild science from zero? And in Feynman's view, it was, all matter is made up of atoms, tiny particles, which, if you bring them close together, kind of attract each other, but can also, if you get too close, they repel. So that was like that piece. And I felt like, okay, that's a great jumping off point for me. And I wanted to go from atoms into, elements and fundamental particles and forces. And I was going to build you from zero to PhD. That was the original vision for Veritasium. Now, I think it took me probably 6 months to a year to realize that was a bad plan. And the reason it was a bad plan was that I was imagining someone who had not had a lot of background in science, like had not learned about atoms, for example, and yet wanted to see videos about it on YouTube. And that demographic is super small. And I found them in my first year. In my first year, the channel grew to 17,000 subscribers, which I was pretty pleased with. I mean, those were different times. But at the same time, like, it wasn't going to take my channel big. And that's kind of something that I realized. I think watching Minute Physics, who joined about 6 months after me, and his trajectory really showed me that I was on the wrong path, because he was making videos about Schrodinger's cat and they were blowing up. And I was like, oh, he's talking to the people who already get this, who get most of it. And they're taking they're science enthusiasts and they're going from here to here. That's where metaphysics is. And so I made this decision to really change tack. Instead of going after, you know, people who don't know much about science, I have to go for the science enthusiasts too. And so I really started changing the videos that I was making. Let me say also that, you know, when I was thinking about the name Veritasium, I was thinking about what I wanted to do. I wanted to make science beautiful. I wanted some sort of beauty element to fit into it. And I was guided by the rhyming couplet from the end of Ode on a Grecian Urn by John Keats, where he says, you know, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. And the original name that I wanted for the website and for the YouTube channel was like truthbeauty.com or beautytruth.com or something. And I'm glad that those were all taken, and that the people who had those addresses wanted an exorbitant sum of money to sell it to me, because that forced me to be more innovative. But you see that word truth come in from that vein into Veritas and into Veritasium. So some element of beauty was meant to be in there as well.
Yeah. I remember, so the very first Veritasium video that I saw, I actually pulled it up right before the show. It's called Misconceptions About Temperature, where, do you remember the plot of that one? So do you want to explain sort of what were you doing at that point in time? What was the idea of these videos?
So with Misconceptions About Temperature, I mean, I was out on the street, I think, with 2 items, getting people to feel them and tell me, you know, which one felt hotter or colder.
Yeah.
And then showing them with a thermometer that they were both in fact the same temperature.
Right.
And this actually goes back to my high school physics class, where, you know, my physics teacher had us hold the gas tap on our desks in the class, and then like the surface of the table or a book or something, and was saying, see, now which feels hot or colder. So I was just replicating, you know, almost exactly what had been taught to me in that way. And so, yeah, this was to teach this idea about thermal conductivity versus like actual temperature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, oh, sorry, go ahead.
One of the things that guided me to do those sorts of videos was the fact that they were popular. Very early on, an article had come out in Australia claiming that 30 or 33% of the population thought that it took the Earth 1 day to go around the sun, as opposed to a year. And I thought that seemed like a pretty extraordinary number. And my friend brought this article to me. And so together we went down to the beach in Sydney, and I brought the camera, and we essentially just asked people these like basic sort of science literacy questions, including that one. And to my surprise, a lot of people gave us that answer of like, yeah, it takes the Earth 24 hours, 1 day to go around the sun. That was a surprise. And we got a beautiful moment from one guy who, when we asked him initially, like, how long does it take? He was there with his cousin, and he refused to think about it. He just threw it to his cousin. He was like, so what do you think, cuz? And the cousin said, well, isn't it a day? And then the first guy says, yeah, it's 24 hours. So that in itself, okay, whatever. We kept asking him questions like, did humans live at the same time as dinosaurs? And debatable question now, counting chickens or something. But so I kept filming him, and he went quiet. And one of the greatest things I think you can do as an interviewer is let people be quiet when they're quiet. Like things were happening. So I was quiet. I was trained on him. And then he just jumps out and he says, hey, it doesn't take 1 day for the Earth to go around the sun. It takes a year. And he had been, you could see it in his face, and you could see it in his cousin's face. And it was just such a beautiful moment. So that's how the video ended. And then that video went up and was shared eventually on Reddit, and did like, I don't know, 500,000 views or something in a few weeks. So that was one of these indications to me that people were interested in that type of content. They were interested in people realizing what's right and what's wrong. And they were interested in what everyone else thinks and stuff like that. So that guided partly this idea about talking to people in the street about physics concepts. The other thing that guided it was my PhD research itself, which had shown that it's so useful to see misconceptions, because unless they're explicitly raised and discussed, people can watch a video and come away with completely the wrong idea and thinking the same thing that they thought before, but with greater confidence. Because like the way that misconceptions debilitate you is at the level of perception. So the perception isn't even happening accurately. It's like you think that they're seeing what they're seeing, but they're not.
Right.
And that's what my research bore out. And it is something I tried to bring to the videos in the early stage. And that was the obvious way to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely say as an audience member that what drew me to that sort of earlier style of Veritasium videos was seeing people, or experiencing for myself that moment that guy had on camera. And, you know, there's beauty in that. So now, how do you see any shift from what you were doing then to how you make videos now? Has the ethos changed? Has the style changed? Obviously your production quality has increased. What do you see as being the switch between, you know, where you were 10 years ago and now?
So I've done fewer of those videos where I'm talking to people on the street, many fewer of those. Part of the reason is it's sort of more onerous, I think, on me to like get up the gumption to go and talk to strangers. It's part of it. I guess right now in the time of COVID, I couldn't do that anyway. Another issue is like I ran through a lot of my favorites of, you know, inertia and of, you know, thermodynamics, basic things like that. I ran through a lot of those, and I don't know that I have any that I have this burning desire to go and talk to people on the street. You know, I've made videos now about, you know, quantum entanglement and spooky action at a distance and quantum computing and, you know, certain things like esoteric things. Maybe the intermediate axis theorem would have got some interesting responses. I don't know, but I've definitely moved into some topics that I feel like are less well tailored for that style of video. But still, if I have the right idea for one of those videos, I still think there's a very powerful way of doing it. And once the vaccine's available, you know, hopefully I'll be out there asking those questions again. Some of my favorite videos are ones that are done in that vein. One of my favorites is about Would You Take This Bet, which I recently rewatched, which is essentially just asking people about, you know, would you bet me $10 just on the street on the flip of a coin? You know, if you win, I give you $10. If you lose, you give me $10, and seeing what people say. Fascinating that basically everyone turns down that bet. And then I up it to like, okay, well, I'll give you 12 and you only have to give me 10 if you lose. And then I go to 15 and then I go to 20. And then for some people I went to 40 or 50. Just really fascinating to see what people's thinking is. Because even at 20 to 10, most people still don't take that bet because they don't want to lose $10. And that plays into this idea of loss aversion, which you can talk about in an academic way, but it's really, I think, engaging to see it in person and to think about what you would do in that situation. And how do you feel about these people that you're seeing in the video? And then to think about loss aversion and think about it in sort of a rational way, and then to take it one step further and say, you know, if you view your life as a series of these types of bets, it's always going to be rational for you to say no, because you are loss averse and it actually feels worse. So it'll always actually feel rational and be rational in a sense to keep saying no to these things. The problem is if you take them on the aggregate, you know that actually you come out ahead when you take bets that are in your favor. As long as you just keep taking them, they work out in your favor. So hopefully that's one of those videos that gets people really thinking about some of these things that are quite statistical and quite abstract, but makes them more concrete and hopefully gets them into that mindset. So I definitely think there's a time and a place for that. But if I'm doing a video, you know, what was my most recent one? I don't know, some of the things I'm looking at. I don't know. It's just some things just don't work for that format. So, you know, I'm doing those things.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of your most recent video, success luck or hard work? Well, I mean, I watched it, but do you want to explain that idea a little bit?
Yeah, this idea has been gestating in me for a long time. I made a video on the second channel a few years ago called Survivor Bias, which is, you know, about the fundamental idea of survivor bias, which is like when you look at a sample, for example, planes that have flown back from Germany in World War II, the planes that you see are not a representative sample of all the planes. Like what you're seeing are the ones that came back. So how are they systematically different from the ones that you don't see, or from that complete sample? So it's this idea about how we make the wrong inference based on a sample which is biased in a very particular way. XKCD, I found this comic after I published my video, has a great panel set where he talks about like someone who won the lottery giving a motivational speech. Like, just keep buying tickets. You just have to keep buying them every day. I am proof that it works out. Like, here I am with my bags of money. Like, I thought that I was never going to make it, but just by continuing to buy those tickets, eventually I won and I made it and I now have lots of money. So you should keep doing this too. And I've seen this come up a number of times. I remember Russell Crowe gave a acceptance speech at the Oscars, and he was like, who would have thought a little guy from Melbourne would be able to, reach the top of his field, but like, I'm just living proof. This is, and it's this whole issue of, yes, that's true. And also it's totally unrepresentative, so that's one piece of the genesis of this. And when I was thinking about the survivor bias thing, I was thinking, think about the people who end up in positions of power. Like, those are kind of by definition, they're survivors, some of the greatest survivors. And I was also thinking about a conversation I had with my friend where we were debating like how fair life is. My friend, who is like an affluent and well-educated person, was like, well, yeah, life seems perfectly fair. And I'm like, the penny dropped for me at that moment. And I was like, oh, I get it. To you, life does seem fair because life is fair to you. You don't have the experience of all the people who are, to whom life is unfair. And so it's very hard for you to imagine that, because we are all so kind of constrained by our own experiences. And so, I mean, that leads a lot of people who are successful and who are in positions of power to create a worldview in which it's like, I got here because of my own, hard work and, diligence and talent, etc. If other people aren't reaching these levels, well, it's their own darn fault. And that's a totally understandable worldview to have, particularly in the context of things like survivor bias, etc. I was kind of motivated to think about these ideas in the context of the current sort of upheaval that's happening in the US. And, people were jumping in to sort of say things about prejudice or discrimination, racism in today's society. And I'm not sure what I had to say about that, because honestly, I don't have much experience in those areas. I like my experience is super limited. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, the thing that I think is worth saying is that, like, if you're born in January or February, you got a better shot at being a hockey player, like 4 times better than if you're born in November or December. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a problem in the country with, for one, the word racism, which means very different things, I think, to different people. To some people, it means lynchings and shootings and like just, vile, and to other people, it means like a tiny implicit bias that, like, when you're contemplating who to open the door for, you might not, or you might think for an extra second before you open it for a certain group of people or for a certain person or whatever. Like, there's just the tiniest little things that come up that I'm convinced, are real and demonstrable and borne out by data. And one conventional or really naive approach to those things is like, well, those are tiny things. What difference could they make in the grand scheme of things? And the point of my video is to say, they can make all the difference in the world to whether you're a hockey player or whether you get the world record or whether you turn out to be elected or not elected, or, like, you can take this, or whether you become an astronaut or not. You can take this, like, from the, throughout every possible sort of competitive outcome, and you can see that there is some intangible thing or some tiny little changes which play a huge role, a crazy outsized role. And so that's the big message that I wanted to get across to people. And I wanted to frame it in a way that is totally devoid of the context of this moment, with the hope that that will reach the people who I want to reach, who actually need to be convinced of these things. You know, people might argue whether, you know, being Black means like the world is sort of slanted against you, but I don't think they're going to argue that like being a hockey player or, you know, being born in December makes it harder to be a hockey player.
Right.
You know, so that's my attempt to talk about those things in a way that I think is effective.
Yeah. It's definitely smart to, I mean, it's a smart approach to take it out of context and just demonstrate the effect. Because I already just bringing up the idea of applying that to racism and using the examples you talked about, I noticed in my mind, I'm going, well, but we have to be able to have a conversation of scales, right? Because clearly in approximate sense, of course, there's a difference in scale between, you know, lynchings and whether you hold the door for somebody. But that's not the point of what you're talking about. That's a separate point that, should you bring it up in context, it's too easy to get distracted from. But just to boil it to the principle and use really to use examples that are really hard to get distracted from and really easy to see the effects of, that's an awesome way to communicate that idea. So, well, yeah, props for that. How do you come up with, like, how do you go about asking questions like that and figuring out how to approach ideas that you communicate in that way?
I don't know, I think, is the short answer.
That's fair.
I come up with a lot of ideas through interactions with people. I think it's one of the great starters of, a lot of these ideas is just random conversations with people. One of the early videos that went viral for me was like dropping a slinky in slow motion. And that came from a conversation at a party with physicists, where we were talking about a previous experiment I did, which was dropping a weight that was attached to a chain that formed a U and was attached to a railing. So it was like, you know, anyway, you drop those two weights, they're identical weights, but one has a chain which hangs down and forms a U. And it turns out that the weight with a chain attached actually accelerates faster and hits the ground before the free weight. So somehow something about the chain, even though everything is free falling, causes this weight to accelerate faster than free fall. Kind of a crazy idea, but I did the experiment. And at the party, the guy was like, well, you didn't do a control experiment where it was just the weight and then the chain dangling straight down to the ground. And he said, maybe that would have been different. And he cited this thing about a slinky. And I was like, well, I don't know. Anyway, so it's sort of how these things like popped up. And then over the years, I feel like I've developed a kind of instinct with what feels right, like what feels like a good way into this topic. Like I need a story or something, or I need something sparks me, or this is the demonstration I need to do, or but I don't think that the ideas I have are like necessarily the best ones. They're just the ones that like occur to me. And the frustrating thing I think about being a YouTuber is how often I think of a topic and I feel like I could explain it just off the top of my head, and then how poorly it comes out once I've written it and I've filmed it and I've animated it, and I look at the thing and I'm like, oh, it's lost the zing that this would have had if I was just in a classroom and I was just able to be me, and there would be more ums and ahs, but it would be clearer in a sense because I would be thinking the thoughts and I would be expressing it in such a way that just like actually gets it out in the way that I want to communicate it. So I don't know, maybe like this is a ad for podcasting, because it's more of that form, right, than of the like I'm gonna script and polish this.
Or even like Instagram Live, where if you could you have the idea, you're sitting around and you're like, you know what, I'm gonna go explain this in the next 15 minutes. I'm gonna go live on Instagram and be like, hey, I have this idea, here's how I'm explaining it. It's not gonna be a video. Great, thanks everybody, bye, done.
That's an interesting idea that I have not had the instinct to jump on.
Yeah.
I have such fears about live things. This
Yeah.
comes back to my fears, but I also think that like generally things that are live are less likely to be polished and rewatched and stuff like that. So when I
Sure.
contemplate the use of my time, but maybe I'm making the wrong calculation there.
Yeah, I don't
Or
know.
maybe I have so few original ideas that when I have like a good idea for something, I'm hoarding it and like, no, this is my baby. I need to make this into the thing that it needs to be before I put it out there. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
Sometimes
that's fair.
I can wrestle with a topic for a month before it gets out. Like video from earlier this year called "This Equation Will Change How You See the World" was probably my most iterated video of all time. And it's funny, it's a video about iterations. But like I filmed the introduction and then scrapped it, and refilmed, and redid animations and stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah.
A lot of that goes into it.
So last question on the sort of luck versus hard work idea. What's the solution? Like what do you do once you have that understanding?
I hope that you try to contribute to the luck of others, which is kind of how I ended that video. This idea that there are things that we as individuals can do to improve others' lives and others' chances. The book, or sorry, the video is based partly on a book called Success and Luck, which I put in the description, which is kind of, I mean, the economist who wrote the book, his conclusion is, in essence, like we should be paying more in taxes. And I think there's a certain, and he has the tax in a particular kind of way. I think it's a very strong consumption tax. So it's essentially you get taxed on the money you spend. And it's more than just a sales tax. It's like, and what's interesting about it is you don't get taxed on money you save, and you don't get taxed on money you invest. And I think that's a really fascinating concept, and I find it personally appealing, but I'm no economist. But I do like the idea of sort of forcing people to consider more carefully how they're spending. And then rich people who want to spend a ton, like, fine, but they're just going to end up getting taxed a lot more. The sort of analogy he brings up is like, would you like to drive a Lamborghini on a potholed road, or would you like to drive a Porsche on a smooth road? With this concept that like we are maybe skewed too much into the Lamborghini potholed road than into the Porsche smooth road. And like, frankly, like I think everyone would be better off with, the Porsche smooth road scenario than with the Lamborghini pothole scenario. So I do feel like that the US is skewed a little bit that direction.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that, from what I've seen trying to study, successful people and the ideas around success to the extent that I have, the only other thing that I would add to what you said is it's also important to study failure. It's important to study what it is that makes people fail, external or internal influences. There's this awesome book by Napoleon Hill called Outwitting the Devil, where he essentially talks about what are the things that are under your control that contribute to your being less likely to succeed. And it's similar to like what you said about should I risk the failure of a creative pursuit, or should I take the safe route and guarantee that I'm going to fail at a creative pursuit? And I'm those are not your exact words, but that was the idea. And habits that you can get into will do things like guarantee the failure of a creative pursuit because you never pursue it. So that's the only other thing that
I made another video a couple years ago which was about this idea of learned helplessness, the idea of sort of learning that your environment wasn't gonna enable you, so kind of not even trying, I think. And I feel like I've gotten into that mentality myself sometimes. I consider it like employee versus entrepreneur mentality. That's kind of how I see it. And there have been times when I've been an employee. I remember back when I was at Queen's doing some research, I took this graph to my supervisor and I was like, oh, look, it's not working. This is not happening. And he was like, well, why didn't you do, X, Y, and Z? And I was like, well, yes, now that you say that, that's obvious. I could have thought of it. I could have done it, but I didn't, because my default, my sort of frame for what I'm doing right now is I am executing your sort of directives. I'm not thinking for myself about what I'm going to do. And so I still have to like wrestle with those two things inside my brain sometimes. It's like, am I in employee mentality right now? Am I just sort of like going through the motions? Or I'm in entrepreneur mentality where it's like the outcome is what I need. And like, I'm not going to stop at anything short of this. And I'm going to look to optimize the outcome and push it further. I have this problem now. I hire people, and sometimes the work they bring to me very much feels of this employee mentality and doesn't feel like they're taking the ball and taking it further. So it's a continual, now I have to, sort of go back to them and be like, well, did you try X, Y, Z? And hopefully, yeah, pushing more people into that entrepreneur type mentality will be effective and productive for them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wanted to comment just on kind of, I think you're doing a huge contribution to people being able to learn and grow their mindset in the development of their, luck or just their progression as a person. And so I think for me, what I feel like has limited my success has always been not having the prerequisite knowledge to know that I need to do something differently. So I think the kind of channel that you have is super helpful for me, and I'm sure, tons of people.
I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Alex, any other topics or questions that you wanted to hit before we move on to off topic and Q&A?
No, I think that was great.
How about you, Derek? Anything that you wanted to hit that we have not touched on yet?
I don't think so. I think we've done pretty well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm very much enjoying this conversation, but I do want to be sensitive to your time. So before we go into the off topic, I want to remind the audience that we will have a Q&A session, a short Q&A session after the off topic. If you've got questions, feel free to stick them in the chat. We'll go ahead and we'll call on you one by one. You can unmute, ask your question, and I'll go over the rules for that when it's Q&A time. But we'll now move to the off topic. So for anybody who is new to the Switch, the off topic is a chance for our guests to come in with some topic that is not directly related to the main topic. It can be tangentially related. Sometimes it's serious, sometimes it's silly. It can be deep or not. So, Derek, what do you have for us?
Well, the topic that came to the front of my mind was, how do you figure out truth in the current environment, like given social media, etc. It's a topic that's been on my mind for a long time. I have tried to tackle this issue in the past. I made a video about it, and a lot of the pushback that I saw was that truth can't be objectively determined, and that it is the ideas that I agree with which are true, or which I consider true. And I fundamentally reject that. At the same time, I don't know how we get to some sort of ideal, because we are in such a really sort of distraught, situation right now. But like, how do we establish things that are really true? That is, I guess, a question that I bring to you. That is my off topic. And I don't have answers, but maybe it's an interesting thought starter, or maybe it's just like rehashing something that people have been annoyed with for ages. I don't know.
No, but I think that's an important thing to think about, because I think that it also depends on what you mean by true. And I've heard people use different definitions. The one that I tend to operate on is that truth is what exists regardless of whether you think, or regardless of what you think about it, regardless of your opinions and understandings. There's essentially the way that things are outside of that. You can almost think of it like maps and territory, right? In your mind, you've got a map that in some sense is trying to correspond to the territory, and truth is the territory that you're trying to map out. But there are other definitions of truth that I've heard that seem operable in different circumstances. For example, you can talk about truth as what is useful in a certain context, more pragmatic, I guess. There's an interesting example I heard that there's the wisdom, the folk wisdom, I guess, that porcupines throw their quills, and that's not literally true, but it will keep you safe. And if you have that as an understanding, as a functional understanding, that allows you to continue through the world. But I don't know that I would call that true as much as useful. And there are other examples like that, but I think that, yeah, it depends on what you mean.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one place that my mind goes, and this is quite topical, I guess, in the lead up to an election, is in the things that are posted on Facebook.
Yeah.
I am fairly sympathetic to an argument like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube are places for people to have free and open discourse, and the platform shouldn't take a stand on what is said there. I'm sympathetic to that view. And then I find some sort of problem with once they become involved in promoting or spreading that information or potential misinformation, then that becomes a bigger concern to me. But their business models are such that what they do is raise up some things into prominence and suppress other things. So I really struggle with that, with like, who's going to be the arbiter of truth and how do you do that in practice? And is a post so deleterious that it needs to be addressed or something, or these social media sites need to do something? And I'm not even thinking about the most egregious examples. I'm just thinking of like, your common everyday kind of stuff. Like, and if we can't interact with the territory as it really is, but instead we're interacting with other people's maps and they're horribly warped and distorted, like, I think that that's a bad outcome for everyone.
Yeah.
Part of the core idea of Veritasium is that, and part of the core idea why I do the things I do is because I believe that when we can get at the truth and when we live in that sort of truth-seeking mindset, we live better, happier lives. And that's kind of like the deep underlying thing underneath Veritasium, which is, that I hope people take away. How do we do that in an environment which is so non-representative and so tribal?
I feel like I have a hard time kind of reconciling how I see certain spaces coming to a mutual understanding or even an acknowledgement of certain facts. But I see the same people not having those characteristics offline, in person. And I feel like there's this, this is obvious, but there's a certain kind of human interaction that I think tells us all a lot about the other person's intentions. And basically, like, in person, it's much easier to get to realize we basically have the same goal here, right? We want, in general, people to be happier and healthier and better. But when the first thing you're exposed to is not the person kind of smiling or having an affect, it's a bunch of text that is aggressive. On those platforms and in those contexts, I don't see it happening. YouTube and other a little bit more discussion or like our potentially long form content or refined content like what you put out. It gives more space for people to listen and understand, and they're there with an expectation potentially of learning something. But when it comes to just conversation, I think if we could really just establish like one of our last guests said, you know, he was of a different political alignment, and once we came to the understanding, like, we all are searching for these maps that create a better life. And once you have that mutual understanding, I feel like maybe we'll be able to breach into, okay, so what about what you're thinking is not aligned with the map I have, and maybe backtrack. But that's how I would think of it.
Yeah, I think in other words, it sounds like what you're saying, Alex, is that something like, you know, a social media platform's policy on how to police content it's really a cosmetic solution to a deeper problem of people's attitudes toward truth. So, yeah. Cool. Well, let's go ahead and move into Q&A. We have a couple of people lined up in the comments. I also went back through the chat a little bit to look for a couple of questions. So first up, we will have David Johnson. And sorry, before you start, we have a couple of rules. First, try to keep your question brief. Second, please keep it on topic. Third, please be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything that anyone has said, but be polite, be courteous. And then lastly, for the sake of time, we will not be doing follow-up questions. So please try to keep your question succinct. All right, go ahead, David.
Very quickly, 6 years ago, I went on a special tour, got these souvenirs. Can you explain why 96 million more of these led to your apparently most viewed video, and why? Why did this happen?
I think that's fantastic that you've got those. I was sending out another 100 today. I'm almost down to 0. I think that video was powerful for a couple reasons. Actually, you know, I talked about this in video, why my video went viral, which is essentially like, it had a good title, it had a thumbnail that people were engaged to click on, and once they clicked on it, they watched that video for a reasonable period of time. So to YouTube, it was a signal that, like, this is interesting, not just to people who are science enthusiasts, but to all people. And we can show it to lots of people and almost guarantee that it'll get clicked and that it'll get watched. And that's what YouTube wants. They're optimizing for that. So this video was like, you know, catnip for the YouTube algorithm, and it just spread it out there insanely much. What's interesting to me in the back end of YouTube now is you can see impressions. So essentially YouTube's telling you how many times it shows a particular title and thumbnail to people. And on the front end, all you can see is the views. So, you know, you might look at a video that I just put out and be like, okay, well, it had 1.6 million views. Like, and this other video with the shade balls has 48 million views. So how much better is the shade ball video than the luck video, for example? What you don't see is that those 48 million views come from, you know, maybe 1 billion impressions, but the luck videos only had, you know, I don't know, 20 million impressions or something. So the potential for these videos to do differently well it is sort of controlled by YouTube, but you only see it in the back end. No one sees it in the front end. Like, what was the potential for this video? So yeah, I mean, YouTube is optimizing for things, and it's working very well for YouTube. And my view has always been, if YouTube grows the pie, you know, or raises the tide, you know, it'll lift all boats. So if they're doing their job right, it's the right thing. I still struggle when I see that, and I think, well, I would rather have, you know, 10 or 20 million fewer views on that video and a few more on these other videos, but I don't get to make that call. So YouTube gets to make that call. What can I say? Good title, thumbnail, and a decent video execution.
Thank you, David. Next up is Andy.
Hi, yeah, I'll try not to take too long. Sorry, I'm not a 1 million subscriber YouTuber, so I'm not very polished. My question though is actually regarding YouTube, and like what you were talking about earlier about, I don't know, I guess what I heard was, do you think that being like a YouTuber makes you more effective as like an ambassador of science? I know in terms of like addressing every like layman's questions or like even misconceptions, and then kind of making science more relevant because it's addressing, it's like trying to learn science for the sake of answering a specific curiosity rather than like social pressure from like an exam or a job or something like that. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think being a science YouTuber is like obviously a super cool job, for one thing. And I think kind of like what you're saying, I do get to pick off what I think are like the really nice pieces of science to demonstrate and show off and excite people. And I also think that the process of like really learning science and being able to be a science practitioner or a science researcher is tough. And there's some like tedious and strenuous, like hard work that you've got to go through. And as a YouTuber, you can do the fun stuff. So maybe I've got mixed feelings about it. Like some people are like, oh, well, everything should be able to be like this. And I'm like, no, sometimes there is a slog. Like sometimes it's just about putting in the hard yards. But hopefully the YouTube video plays a role in sort of that inspirational piece and in that sort of raising the profile. And as you say, like making it more, cool and relevant to be into science or to, so that's definitely my goal is to put science in that place. I don't know. Does that answer your question? Awesome.
We got 2 thumbs up. Excellent. Thank you very much, Andy. Next up is Joseph.
Hi guys, thanks for another great interview, and thanks for joining us this evening. I just have a quick question. Are you familiar with the Montessori form of education, and what are your thoughts on that approach towards learning? We had a previous guest that had spoken, quite extensively about that, but it is based more on scientific observation. So any thoughts on that specific form of learning?
I feel like I'm not well enough versed in Montessori to be able to say what I think is good or not. I can mention something which might be a non sequitur, but I can tell you a little story.
Go for it. I mean, I live with non sequiturs.
This probably has nothing to do with Montessori, but so I was in San Francisco at some point out at a bar, and I met someone who was ostensibly a teacher, and they were trying to set up a new school. And the idea with the school was it's going to be really free flowing, and I think they weren't really separating the kids by age, and they weren't going to really have a curriculum, and they were just going to do things like wind is going to be our theme, and so like today we're just going to talk about some wind stuff, and then like that was going to get them into talking about air molecules and talking about velocity, and like it was just gonna like, and then tomorrow we can talk about wind turbines, and they were just gonna like have theme-based classes, and it was otherwise very free-flowing. Like the kids had to have ownership over it, so kids had to decide what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it and explore it and all that sort of stuff. And so this was going to be a brand new school that they were just setting up, and so I was asking the teacher, like, how do you like it? And they hadn't done any classes yet, but they were still in this setup phase. And she was saying, for me as a teacher, it's really hard right now because the school seems really disorganized, and they're not giving me a lot of direction, and they're basically telling me to like make these things. And the thing I said to her was like, do you fear that maybe teaching without much structure like that and getting the kids to like have the ownership and decide which way to go, etc., do you think that might give them this same feeling that you have of being sort of adrift and without direction and guidance? And she thought it was I don't know. She thought I was crazy. She thought I was nuts. And I was like, to me, so I have this big issue, and you're seeing a piece of a rant here. So when I look at education research and when I look at the things that come out, a lot of it to me looks like fashion. A lot of it to me looks like the 80s coming again with reference to fashion. A big idea in education when I was doing my PhD was constructivism, the idea that everyone has to construct their own knowledge, that teaching is not the transference of information from the teacher's head to the student's head, but it is an active and effortful process on the part of the learner, and they must construct it themselves. Totally true. And also, in my view, not very instructive about how to actually do instruction. Yes, students need to build their own understanding. And no, I do not just transmit information from my head into yours, maybe through speech. That's not how it works. But it doesn't necessarily say, like, do you have to have your hands on something to learn it? Like, could you learn anything from me just telling you? Questions like that are not answered by the constructivist sort of basic thing. And that basic thing is the thing that got spread out everywhere. And so all of a sudden you got a lot of classes where telling was anathema to learning. And I take issue with that. I just think that there are a lot of reasons where telling doesn't work. And there's a lot of times when telling does work. And this is something that my PhD kind of showed, was that if you are telling people and they have strong misconceptions and you don't address those misconceptions at all, they're going to come out of that feeling like they get it, feeling more confident, and they're going to bomb the test. That's kind of what I kind of define as like the person who considers themselves not a physics person. You might hear these stories from time to time where at the end of the class, they're like, I thought I got it. I thought I was understanding everything up to the exam, and then I got 45. Like, what happened? To me, like, it's a key symptom of a particular affliction. There's sort of a dogma out there that's like, lectures bad, discovery good, you know? And I just don't buy into it. Often lectures are bad because the lecture is not great, or I think very commonly the lecture is spitting out a whole bunch of information and novel concepts that the students just have no ability to work with in that moment. So this is about working within the zone of proximal development, if I'm to bring up some terminology from educational research. But in other words, you know, you got to hit the students where they are and not like above them. And this is a typical problem in a physics lecture. But if they watch an episode of Oprah, they got no problem following that. The reason? Because all the words she's using, all the things she's talking about are things that people know already. So she's not introducing a whole bunch of new terms like F equals MA. That's hugely complicated. What do people actually conceptualize as F and M and A? And now you've got an equation relating them. And most people don't, like in intro physics classes, most people don't have a solid conception of acceleration. Instead, it's some sort of muddled thing about speed, but they don't realize that it's non-differentiated. Anyway, all of this is to say, in my view, some of the most important sort of grounding truths of education are that people can only handle like 4 or 5 novel pieces of information at most at a time. And they need to master those concepts. They need to become schema so that, you know, when I say acceleration, there's nothing's non-differentiated. So I'm all about mastery. I'm all about maintaining that finite resource of working memory. And by building the store of long-term memory and by automating processes, for example, in algebra, you really just need to automate, you know, by doing things a bajillion times, make it so you don't have to spend working memory on like how you're doing your dividers or your subtractions. Like that all should just be like muscle memory, how it should feel. Really what I mean is it's in long-term memory, which frees up the capacity, this limited capacity of working memory to really chunk the new things that are coming at them. So if I were to talk about my philosophy of education, that's it. My fear is we jump into this zone of like discovery and constructivism, which, you know, is not wrong-headed in itself, but it ignores this fundamental basic thing, which is like students have like this 4 pieces of novel information that they can hold and work with in working memory at a time. And so as a teacher, your job has got to be to direct that attention, because with undirected attention, you get a mess. So that's my fear of like when discovery or constructive things go wrong, they go wrong because we are totally bombarding, overwhelming, and, you know, leading to a sort of oversaturation of those finite cognitive resources. Hopefully this relates somewhat to Montessori. I've got no idea, but like I say, you just saw a piece of
it does
rant,
has to do with self-construction.
That's
So yeah, I mean, so that's a really critical part. So that was a good answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.
I don't even know, man, but hopefully that's useful in some way.
All right, Derek.
Chase, if you want to take a couple more, we can keep going.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I'm wheeling and dealing. Like let's roll this.
Great. We've got we have a couple more. Next up is Tanya.
Hi, yeah, it's Tanya.
Oh, sorry, Tanya.
That's okay. I had a question. So I was on your wiki page, and it said something about being a critic of Facebook. Now, exactly
Oh.
what is your understanding, or what is your take on that? Why did they have that on there?
Yeah. So you should check out a couple videos I made. I made one called Facebook Fraud. Oh, it's a little strong. And another one. So let me be frank that I don't love social media as a person. I feel like it doesn't appeal to me for a couple reasons. One is just that I find maybe it causes too much of a time sink, or I don't know. I struggle with social media, and I wish in some ways that I were better able to harness some of these platforms, because it would be useful in getting a message out. But I find it sort of maybe deleterious to my mental health, maybe to spend too much time in those worlds. The specific issues with Facebook and the specific Facebook criticism that I leveled some sort of 5 or 6 years ago related to like farms. That it seemed to me that what was happening on YouTube was, or what was happening on Facebook was, there was an industry that popped up around the world where people would essentially pay for likes. And to not appear suspicious, those like farms also spuriously clicked like on a variety of other pages. At some point, I had some credits from Facebook that I handed off to a friend who was doing more on Facebook than I was. And I said, you can spend these credits or whatever, and you can try to grow my Facebook page. At the time, I had only a couple thousand Facebook followers, but I had like 80,000 YouTube followers. So I think it was rational to believe there were more people out there who maybe wanted to be following my page on Facebook and didn't know about it. So, my friend tried to do this advertising thing. And what I ended up with was a page that had like 80,000 followers, and the majority of them were from particular countries, Bangladesh, Philippines, Nepal. I list out these countries, and it's like countries that have no interest in actually following my stuff. And they were people who were not interested in my stuff. So I suspected like maybe these people are from click farms. And after that, when I would post my videos on Facebook, rather than getting more reach, they would get less reach, even though my page had grown from 2,000 followers to like 82,000 followers. And the reason they were getting less reach, I think, is because I had accumulated 80,000 people who actually weren't engaged and didn't actually care about what I was doing. And what I had done was I had paid for that through YouTube's credits, or through Facebook's credit system. And then my friend thought they were doing me a solid by putting in some of their own money to grow it even further. And they were really excited by the number. What I was more interested in was what was the impact, and the impact was negative, not positive, which was strange. And then on Facebook's side, you would then have to pay even more to try to reach those people, many of whom were not even like real people or engaging with pages in a real way. So to investigate this further, kind of as a scientist, I created a new page called Virtual Cat. And on the Virtual Cat page, I said something like, this is a stupid page where I'm only going to post mundane stuff that nobody wants to see. Like only an idiot would like this page. That was like stated in the sort of the bio of Virtual Cat. And then I paid for some advertising of that page to try to get followers through Facebook's system. And what I thought I would do first, this is a very scientific first principles, was my first idea was I'm going to advertise this page only in Canada, Australia, the UK, and the US, because I want to show that there's no like farms, there's no click farms here. Right? I want to show that if I try to advertise in these places, I just don't accumulate a following, because these people are not idiots, and they're also, these people are real people, is kind of what I wanted to show. And then once I've done phase one, now I'll advertise it globally, and I'll show that I just rack up the clicks in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Philippines, etc., showing that there's these massive like farms which are just, clicking on there and essentially costing me money. Okay. So I did that. When I started in phase one, immediately I started getting likes. I started getting likes from Canada, Australia, the UK, the US, which are the only places that I'd targeted the page. So it was kind of nuts for me to realize that there was some non-genuine liking behavior happening in those countries as well. And the fraud part of this, to me, seemed like Facebook should know this. They should be able to identify people who are acting in ways that are not consistent with the majority of their users. So when I went and looked at these users who had liked the virtual cat page, they'd also liked thousands of other pages. And I wondered to myself, what kind of person likes thousands of pages? That doesn't seem like genuine behavior. And yet Facebook was profiting off the fact that I was paying for advertising. And then they were profiting once you have that following to try to reach that following. And they're very hard to reach because they're not even genuine people. So that was the Facebook criticism in a nutshell.
Great. And thank you for that. Just real quick, I like your shirt with the patterns and stuff. What exactly is that?
This shirt is a SciShow t-shirt, and this is the Lunar Lander. So
Interesting.
Nice.
Thank you.
Cool.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Tanya, for the question. And our last question goes to Shrikant.
Derek, it was delightful hearing your story. And you seem to be having a great time doing this YouTube channel. What are some of your favorite things about being a YouTuber?
I guess one of my favorite things is that my job is thinking about things that are interesting to me, learning about them, and then making a video to communicate that with the world. I love that process in a sense. It's also a painful process, but largely I enjoy completing that process, I think, and putting videos out there in the world. And then I feel like it's gravy when people get in touch with me and they say like, oh, this was meant so much to me, or this changed my life, or this, made me want to go into physics or, study these things. So I feel like I get double rewards. I get like, in a sense, I want to tell these people like, I'm just doing these videos for me. Like I can't stop if I tried, like I'm doing what I love, and I'm delighted to be doing that. And then it is like the second blessing and the additional thing that it has a reach and that it impacts people's lives. And that delights me maybe more than anything. Because I do want to be doing good in the world. And one of the things I think is most important is to be uniquely useful. And that's been something I've been striving towards. And I feel like largely I'm there. Even having said that, I see so much more to go. I see so much more, opportunity to refine what I do and experiment and change formats and try to reinvent what this is and how to connect with people. So, I'm happy about the state of the challenge, and I'm happy about the work I get to do every day, which I think is the best position to be in.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Awesome. And
Thank you.
on that very positive note, Derek, that is the end of the interview. If people are interested in following up, finding out more about you, we said it a million times, where can they?
I'm pretty sure Chase was saying something, but he's just dropped out.
Am I back? Hello?
Oh, he's back.
Okay, great. Well, hopefully
if people are interested in finding out more about me.
Yes, where do they go?
YouTube.com/Veritasium is probably the best. That's the YouTube show. Like I say, I kind of hate social media, but sometimes I'm around on Twitter and Facebook and TikTok, but don't bet on it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being generous with your time, and
thanks for having me. It was a really fun conversation, so I really enjoyed it.